The storm in the ballroom. The Celeste Grand Hotel gleamed like a beacon of high society, its massive chandeliers casting shimmering reflections on the polished marble floors. Waiters in crisp uniforms weaved between Hollywood's elite, balancing silver trays adorned with fine champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more than a month's rent for an average worker. Keanu Reeves adjusted the cuffs of his tailored black suit, offering polite smiles to the occasional admirer who approached with hesitant admiration. He had long grown accustomed to these industry events, gatherings where genuine conversations were rare and masks of self-importance were plenty. He wasn't here for the glitz, nor the politics of the industry. He attended because he was invited, and turning down an invitation from the Celeste Grand's prestigious annual gala often carried unintended consequences. But in truth, Keanu had never been a man concerned with status. He preferred quiet moments, real people, and the kind of life experiences that grounded him in reality. Yet tonight, reality had other plans. Across the ballroom, standing near the expansive windows that framed the city skyline, was Dylan Carter, a journalist infamous for cornering celebrities, trapping them with his razor-sharp tongue, and feeding the public scandal on a silver platter. Dylan wasn't just any reporter. He was the kind who believed that truth was secondary to spectacle. The louder the controversy, the bigger his name grew. And tonight, his target was clear: Keanu Reeves. The setup. Dylan had done his research. He had spent weeks analyzing every interview Keanu had ever given, searching for gaps, inconsistencies, anything that could be twisted into a headline. And then he found it: a simple silver crucifix that Keanu had been seen wearing for years. Faith. It was a delicate subject in Hollywood, where personal beliefs could be weaponized in the wrong hands. Dylan had a plan. He would push Keanu into an uncomfortable corner, force him to say something that could be turned into fuel for controversy. Cameramen had been carefully positioned. Microphones were ready. The moment Keanu arrived, Dylan made his move. "Mr. Reeves." His voice rang with practiced confidence. "Mind if we have a quick chat?" Keanu turned, his expression calm but aware. He recognized Dylan immediately. How could he not? The man had built a career tearing people down. Keanu had no reason to fear him, but he had every reason to tread carefully. "Of course," Keanu said, his voice even, kind. Dylan smirked. This was too easy. The first strike. Cameras rolled. The small circle of guests around them turned their attention toward the unfolding exchange. Dylan held his microphone like a sword, ready to strike. "You've always been admired for your humility, Keanu," Dylan began, his tone friendly but laced with intent. "But in an industry that thrives on power and control, you seem out of place. Would you say that's because of your faith?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. He had been in the industry long enough to recognize a trap when he heard one. "My place in the world isn't determined by an industry," he said simply. "It's determined by how I treat people, how I live my life." Dylan nodded, pretending to be impressed. "So you're saying Hollywood doesn't shape who you are?" Keanu smiled. "I think Hollywood is just a place. Who we are comes from within." Dylan's smirk faltered for half a second. Keanu wasn't giving him the soundbite he wanted. "That's interesting," Dylan pressed, shifting tactics, "because many would argue that celebrities have a responsibility to influence the world around them. Would you agree that an actor's personal beliefs should be shared with the public?" Keanu took a moment before answering. "I think people should be free to believe what they want, without being pressured to explain or justify it." Dylan saw his opening. "But Keanu, you wear a crucifix," Dylan said, his voice growing sharper. "A symbol of Christianity, a religion that has been at the center of many historical conflicts. Do you think it's responsible to display that publicly?" A hush fell over the nearby guests. The energy in the room shifted. Keanu exhaled quietly. He had been expecting something like this, but not so soon. Dylan waited, eager for hesitation, for a slip-up. But instead, Keanu simply reached for the silver cross resting against his chest. "This," Keanu said softly, holding it between his fingers. "This was my mother's." Dylan blinked. "Excuse me. My mother gave this to me when I was young," Keanu continued, his voice gentle. "She told me that faith isn't about labels or politics. It's about kindness, about love, about helping people when they need it most." Dylan opened his mouth, but Keanu wasn't finished. "You know, I met a man once on the subway," Keanu said, looking Dylan in the eyes. "He had nothing, no home, no job, barely any food. I gave him my seat, and we talked for a while. He told me that kindness is the only thing in life that doesn't cost a dime but can change everything." Keanu smiled. "So when I wear this cross, it's not about making a statement. It's about remembering the people who showed me kindness when they didn't have to." Silence. The crowd around them was no longer watching a confrontation. They were watching a lesson unfold. Dylan had come prepared for a fight, but he had been met with something he couldn't manipulate: humility, sincerity, and truth. For the first time in a long time, the journalist had no words. The unraveling begins. Dylan cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. His mind raced for a way to turn this around, to push Keanu back into a corner. But something in the room had changed. People were no longer looking at Keanu as the subject of an attack. They were looking at Dylan. A few guests exchanged glances. A woman in an elegant black gown whispered something to her companion, who nodded. A reporter nearby slowly lowered his own microphone, as if realizing that this was not the scandal they had expected. Dylan felt the shift, and for the first time that evening, doubt crept into his carefully constructed plan. Keanu offered him a small, knowing smile. "I think we all have different ways of seeing the world, Dylan," he said. "But at the end of the day, what matters is how we treat each other." Dylan swallowed hard. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. And yet, as the cameras captured every second, it was only the beginning. The cracks in the facade. The air in the Celeste Grand Hotel ballroom had changed. It was no longer the glittering, carefree playground of Hollywood's elite. It was something else now. A stage where a different kind of performance was unfolding. Dylan Carter had stepped into the spotlight, expecting to conduct an interrogation, to take control, to put Keanu Reeves in a position where he would have to defend himself. But instead, he found himself facing a man who needed no defense. Keanu had answered his questions not with anger, not with fear, but with calm, unwavering sincerity. And worse, for Dylan at least, the crowd had noticed. It wasn't just about Keanu's words. It was the way he said them, the way he stood with quiet confidence, the way his very presence seemed to disarm Dylan's carefully rehearsed attack. And the cameras were rolling. Dylan could not afford to lose this battle. He forced a smile, tightening his grip on the microphone, as if it were his last lifeline. The ballroom may have turned against him, but he still had one weapon left: persistence. He wasn't done. Not yet. The counterattack. Dylan's mind worked quickly. He had to reframe the moment, spin it, make Keanu seem out of touch, unrealistic, knave. He laughed, shaking his head slightly. "That's a beautiful sentiment, Keanu." "Really, it is." Keanu tilted his head, sensing the shift in tone. "But let's be real for a moment," Dylan continued, voice laced with practiced charm. "You talk about kindness like it's the answer to everything. But we live in a world where people struggle every day. Millions of people out there don't have the luxury of sitting in a fancy ballroom, talking about faith and kindness. Some people don't get a second chance." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's true." Dylan saw his opening and went for the throat. "You've made millions of dollars in this industry. You have more than most people could dream of. You talk about giving a man your subway seat, but is that enough? What about real problems? Poverty, injustice, corruption. Do you think simple acts of kindness can actually fix those?" The trap was set. Dylan wasn't going to attack Keanu's character directly. Instead, he would paint him as idealistic, detached, a man who had no real understanding of struggle. It was a classic move, one that had worked on many public figures before. Force them to justify themselves. Make them doubt their own words. And then, when they hesitate, strike. But once again, Keanu didn't stumble. Instead, he smiled. "I understand what you're saying, Dylan," Keanu said, his voice steady. "But I think you're missing something." Dylan blinked. "Am I?" Keanu nodded. "You're assuming that kindness is small, that it's weak, that it's not enough. But I think you're wrong." Dylan chuckled, folding his arms. "Oh, and why is that?" Keanu took a slow breath, his gaze steady. "Because I've seen it change lives." The room was silent. A story that no one knew. Keanu took a step closer, his posture still relaxed. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "A real one. Not something from a movie, not something from a script. Just something that happened a long time ago." Dylan arched an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt. Keanu's voice was quiet, but somehow it carried across the entire ballroom. "There was a kid," Keanu began. "Not a celebrity, not anyone famous. Just a kid from a broken home. His father left. His mother worked as hard as she could to keep food on the table, but sometimes it wasn't enough. He moved from place to place, never really belonging anywhere." He paused, letting the words settle. "He wasn't the best in school. Struggled with reading at first. People thought he was slow, but really, he just needed someone to be patient with him. He got into fights, not because he wanted to hurt anyone, but because he didn't know how else to deal with the anger." Keanu looked directly at Dylan. "But one day, a teacher, just a regular teacher, saw him. Not as a problem, not as a burden, just as a kid. And instead of writing him off, she took the time to help him. She taught him how to love books, how to see the world in a different way. She gave him kindness when no one else did." Keanu let the silence stretch. That kid grew up. He struggled. He lost people he loved. He had to work harder than most. But because of that kindness, because someone chose to see him as more than his mistakes, he found his way. Dylan swallowed. He knew where this was going. "That kid was me," Keanu finished. The room takes sides. No one in the ballroom spoke. The weight of Keanu's words hung in the air like a heavy curtain, suffocating every cynical thought that had existed just moments before. Even Dylan, who had spent years perfecting his ability to twist the truth, found himself momentarily lost. Keanu had flipped the narrative. Dylan had wanted to make him seem out of touch, but now, Keanu wasn't just a famous actor anymore. He was real, a person who had suffered, struggled, and yet still believed in the power of kindness. And worse, the audience believed him. A few guests murmured among themselves. Someone nodded. Another, a producer Dylan recognized from a major news network, actually looked moved. Dylan felt his control slipping. He couldn't let this be the final word. No, he had to twist it back. Desperation in the face of grace. Dylan plastered on a smile, forcing himself to regain control. "That's a touching story, Keanu," he said, keeping his voice light. "Really, it is. But not everyone gets a teacher like that. Not everyone gets a second chance. Don't you think that's unfair?" Keanu gave him a small, knowing look. "Maybe," he said, "but don't you think that's the point?" Dylan frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if we know the world isn't fair, isn't that all the more reason to be kind?" The words were simple, but they hit like thunder. Dylan had nothing to counter them. He had spent his career manipulating people, turning kindness into weakness, twisting sincerity into a weapon. But Keanu's words weren't something that could be spun. They were truth. And truth had a way of exposing those who feared it. The beginning of the end. Dylan had lost control of the conversation. He could feel the eyes in the room shifting, not just watching, but judging. For the first time in his career, the audience wasn't waiting for his next question. They were waiting for him to walk away. Keanu stood there, patient and unwavering. Dylan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. But it wasn't over yet. Because Dylan Carter still had one more card to play. And this time, he was going for blood. When the mask slips, the air in the Celeste Grand Hotel ballroom had become thick with unspoken tension. What had begun as an industry event filled with laughter, false smiles, and empty conversations had now turned into something far more intense, far more real. The battle between Dylan Carter and Keanu Reeves had escalated into something no one had expected. Dylan had walked in, believing he had complete control. He was the master of manipulation, a journalist who had built his career tearing down public figures, exposing their weaknesses, and turning their words into weapons against them. But Keanu Reeves had flipped the script. He hadn't fallen for the traps. He hadn't stumbled, hadn't broken, hadn't even raised his voice. Instead, he had countered Dylan's attacks with humility, truth, and an unwavering belief in kindness. And the crowd had seen it. The audience that had once been eager for a scandal was no longer on Dylan's side. But Dylan wasn't done. Not yet, because he had one final play left. A last desperate gambit. Dylan knew that if he walked away now, it would be a public defeat. He had spent too many years building his reputation, too many years carefully crafting his image as the journalist who could take down anyone. If he let Keanu walk away untouched, it would mean everything Dylan had worked for was a lie. So he forced a smile, though inside, he was boiling with frustration. "That's an inspiring story, Keanu," Dylan said, keeping his tone light, almost friendly. "Really, it is." Keanu said nothing, simply watching him with those calm, knowing eyes. "But let's talk about reality for a second," Dylan continued. "You say kindness is powerful, that it changes lives. But do you think it can really stand up to the ugliness of the world? To corruption? To real pain?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "I think it's the only thing that ever has." Dylan's jaw clenched. He wasn't getting through. Fine. If subtlety didn't work, he'd take it further. The personal attack. Dylan took a small step forward, his smile fading. "You talk about kindness, about second chances," he said, lowering his voice just enough to make it seem like he was about to reveal something dark. "But what about when kindness isn't enough? What about when it fails?" Keanu's gaze didn't waver. Dylan pressed on, his tone sharpening. "You've lost people, Keanu." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Dylan had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. Keanu's past wasn't some secret, but it was sacred. Everyone in the industry knew the tragedies that had shaped him. His father leaving when he was young. His best friend, River Phoenix, dying of an overdose. The loss of his daughter, stillborn. The death of his partner, Jennifer Syme, just a year later. Dylan was dragging all of that into the open, weaponizing it. And in that moment, the crowd wasn't looking at Keanu anymore. They were looking at Dylan. And what they saw wasn't a journalist. It was a man grasping at straws, willing to exploit the worst moments of someone's life just to win an argument. But Dylan didn't see it. Not yet. He was too focused on Keanu, waiting for the reaction, waiting for a flicker of pain, of hesitation. Something he could use. But Keanu didn't break. Instead, he did something that no one expected. He smiled. Not a smirk. Not an act. A real, warm smile. And then, in a voice so gentle that it cut deeper than any shout ever could, he said, "You're hurting, aren't you, Dylan?" The moment everything changed, the room went completely silent. Dylan's smirk faltered. "Excuse me." Keanu took a step closer, his gaze still kind, still unshaken. "I recognize that look," he said softly. "I've seen it before. In myself." Dylan's fingers tightened around the microphone. "What are you talking about?" Keanu studied him for a moment before speaking. "When people try to tear others down, it's usually because they're hurting themselves." Dylan felt his breath catch, but he forced a scoff. "That's rich, coming from a movie star." Keanu didn't react. Instead, he just stood there, as if he could see something in Dylan that no one else could. And suddenly, Dylan felt exposed. For years, he had been the one exposing others. Now he was the one being seen. And it terrified him. The truth about Dylan Carter. The crowd was no longer watching Keanu defend himself. They were watching Dylan Carter unravel. And then, before he could stop it, before he could shove it back down where it belonged, a memory surfaced. A memory from long before he was famous. A small, run-down apartment. His mother, working double shifts just to put food on the table. His father, walking out and never coming back. And a boy, him, growing up angry. Because the world wasn't fair. Because no one had given him kindness. Because he had learned that the only way to survive was to fight, to manipulate, to tear others down before they could do it to him. Dylan had spent years turning that pain into a career. And now, standing in front of Keanu Reeves, he realized something. Keanu wasn't his enemy. Keanu was who he could have been if someone had given him a second chance. For the first time in his life, Dylan Carter had nothing to say. The collapse of a reputation. The cameras were still rolling. The audience was still watching. And they had all seen what had just happened. They had seen Dylan try to tear a man down and fail. They had seen him try to weaponize pain and be met with grace instead. And worst of all, they had seen something that Dylan himself had never wanted to see. The truth. That he was the villain in his own story. Dylan swallowed hard, forcing his usual cocky smirk. Well, I think that about wraps this up. But no one laughed. No one smiled. Because everyone knew Dylan Carter had already lost. Keanu didn't need to say anything else. He had won without ever throwing a punch. Because sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is the truth. The desperate last stand. The fallout begins. The Celeste Grand Hotel Ballroom was no longer just an elegant gathering place for Hollywood's elite. It had become a courtroom, and the verdict had already been decided. Dylan Carter had lost. Not in the dramatic, explosive way scandals usually unfolded, but in the quiet, undeniable way that stripped a person down to their core, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their own arrogance. He had set out to humiliate Keanu Reeves. Instead, he had humiliated himself. The crowd, producers, directors, actors, and industry insiders had seen it all. The cameras had captured every second. Keanu had stood firm, unshaken by Dylan's attempts to provoke him. And worse, he had done something no one had ever done to Dylan before. He had seen through him. Now, as the weight of that reality set in, Dylan's instincts kicked in. When you start losing a fight, change the rules. If the crowd is against you, make yourself the victim. Reframe the narrative. And that's exactly what he planned to do. The art of manipulation. Dylan inhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain composed. The worst thing he could do now was look like he was retreating. Instead, he needed to make himself the misunderstood hero. He gave a calculated chuckle, shaking his head. Wow. I never expected to get a therapy session at a gala. A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd. Nervous laughter, not genuine amusement. Keanu, however, remained perfectly still, watching him with those calm, unreadable eyes. Dylan pressed forward, playing his next card. You know, Keanu, you're a great storyteller, and I have to say, that was a touching moment. Dylan continued, his voice lighter, as if he were in on some kind of private joke. But let's not pretend like I'm the bad guy here. The energy in the room shifted again. A few people frowned. Others glanced at each other, sensing the shift in tone. Dylan felt it. Good. Now he just had to push a little further. After all, he continued, turning slightly so the cameras could still catch him, I was just doing my job. Asking questions. Isn't that what journalists are supposed to do? Reframe. Turn the tables. Make Keanu the aggressor. Dylan smirked. It's funny. The moment someone asks the hard questions, suddenly they're the villain. A few people in the audience stirred, uncertain. Doubt crept in. Dylan had been in this business too long not to know how to plant seeds. Let them think for a second. Let them wonder, was he really the bad guy? Keanu simply gave him a small, knowing smile. Dylan, you're right. Dylan froze. He hadn't expected that. The trap closes. You are doing your job, Keanu said, nodding. And you're very good at it. Dylan felt a flicker of relief. Maybe Keanu was finally backing down. But Keanu continued, what kind of journalist do you want to be? Dylan frowned. Excuse me. Keanu's voice remained gentle, steady. You say you're just doing your job. That's fair. But journalism isn't just about asking questions, is it? The crowd leaned in, waiting. It's about the truth, Keanu said. And what you did here tonight wasn't about the truth. Dylan's stomach tightened. Keanu wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was exposing Dylan's entire career. A career built on sand. The whispers in the room grew louder. And then, someone spoke up. You do this to everyone, don't you? Dylan turned sharply. It was Rebecca Langley, an award-winning actress, standing near the back. She crossed her arms. I remember when you tried to frame me as difficult to work with just because I turned down an interview. A murmur spread. Then another voice. You misquoted me in that article about my divorce. A director this time. More voices followed. Dylan's breath hitched. It was all unraveling. For years, he had gotten away with twisting words, manufacturing controversy, manipulating headlines. And now, people were finally talking about it. Keanu's words had done something Dylan never could have anticipated. They had made people stop being afraid. The breaking point. Dylan clenched his jaw. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had built his career on being untouchable. He had believed that as long as he controlled the story, he controlled everything. But now, the story was out of his hands. For the first time in his life, Dylan Carter had become the headline. He could already see it. Dylan Carter's tactics exposed. The journalist who went too far. Keanu Reeves silences ruthless reporter with kindness. Hollywood turns on Dylan Carter after public humiliation. His breathing quickened. No, not like this. He needed a way out. A lifeline. Something. And then, it came to him. A final, desperate move. A swing for survival. The final card. Dylan took a slow breath, forcing calm into his voice. He met Keanu's gaze and smirked. You know, Keanu, he said, for someone who preaches kindness, you've done a great job turning the entire room against me. Silence. Dylan pressed on. If kindness is so powerful, why do I feel like I'm the only one being judged here? A few people hesitated. It was a cheap trick, but sometimes the simplest tricks worked. Make yourself the victim. Guilt trip them. And then, the unexpected happened. Keanu laughed. Not a mocking laugh. Not a cruel laugh. A genuine, light-hearted chuckle. And then he said, calmly, Dylan, no one turned against you. You just ran out of places to hide. Checkmate. Dylan stopped breathing. He had nothing left. No comeback. No defense. Keanu hadn't just beaten him in an argument. He had made him irrelevant. And in Hollywood, irrelevance was worse than losing. Dylan looked around at the crowd. They weren't angry. They weren't even gloating. They just looked, disappointed. And somehow, that was worse. Dylan lowered the microphone. He had lost. Completely. Utterly. And the worst part, Keanu had never even raised his voice. Dylan turned, slipping away into the crowd. And just like that, his entire career went with him. After the fall, a shift in the air. The Celeste Grand Hotel ballroom had witnessed something unexpected, something rare. It wasn't just another night of Hollywood pleasantries, where actors exchanged smiles that never reached their eyes and whispered about upcoming deals over overpriced champagne. No, tonight had been different. It had been the night Dylan Carter fell from grace. The infamous journalist had arrived, expecting to leave with a scandal that would fuel headlines for weeks. Instead, he had left with his career in ruins. A man who had spent his life controlling stories had finally been exposed by one, and the one responsible for it, Keanu Reeves. Only, he hadn't done it through anger. He hadn't done it through retaliation, humiliation, or cruelty. He had done it with something far more powerful, the truth. And now, as Dylan disappeared into the crowd, the night was quiet again. But Keanu knew something. The echoes of what had just happened would last much longer than tonight. Keanu steps away. Keanu exhaled softly, rolling his shoulders. He hadn't come here to be part of some spectacle. He had attended because he had been invited, because saying no to these things often created more problems than attending them. But now he wanted nothing more than to leave. He could feel the weight of eyes still lingering on him, some with admiration, some with curiosity, and others with a quiet sort of shame, as if they were realizing for the first time that they had let someone like Dylan Carter run unchecked for too long. Keanu wasn't here for their praise. He wasn't here for their approval either. He just wanted some fresh air. So, without another word, he slipped past the remaining clusters of guests, moving through the grand hall, past the tall glass windows that framed the city's night sky. He wasn't in a rush. He never was. But he wanted to be somewhere quieter. Somewhere real. And that's when he heard it. A voice, soft, hesitant, familiar. Mr. Reeves. Keanu stopped. Turning, he found himself looking at a young woman standing near one of the marble pillars. She was clutching a small notepad to her chest, her eyes wide with something that looked like hesitation, or maybe hope. Keanu smiled gently. You can call me Keanu. The woman blinked, startled. And then she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. An unlikely conversation. Her name was Elena Ross, and she was a journalist. Not like Dylan Carter. Not even close. She was young, still new to the industry, still trying to find her place in a world that often seemed too big, too ruthless, too unkind. And tonight had been a wake-up call. I didn't mean to bother you, she stammered, gripping her notepad a little tighter. I wanted to say that was incredible. The way you handled all of that. Keanu smiled, tilting his head slightly. Handled what? Elena hesitated. Dylan Carter. Everything he did. Everything he tried to. Keanu shook his head before she could finish. It wasn't about handling him. Elena frowned. But you took him down. Keanu sighed. No, Elena. He took himself down. She blinked, taken aback. But if you hadn't. I didn't do anything special, Keanu said simply. I just didn't play his game. Elena opened her mouth, and then stopped, because she realized something. He was right. Dylan had dug his own grave. Keanu had simply refused to follow him into it. And that was the difference, a question that mattered. Elena hesitated, chewing on her bottom lip. She had spent years looking up to journalists like Dylan Carter. She had thought that being ruthless, sharp, and unrelenting was the only way to make it in this business. But tonight had shattered everything she thought she knew. Can I ask you something? She said softly. Keanu nodded. Of course. She hesitated. And then she asked the one question that had been eating at her since the moment Dylan had walked away. Do you think people like him ever change? The words hung in the air between them. Keanu was quiet for a long time. And then he smiled. I think anyone can change, he said, but not everyone does. Elena frowned. Why not? Keanu sighed, slipping his hands into his pockets. Because change means looking at yourself, really looking, and a lot of people are too scared to do that. Elena nodded slowly, absorbing his words. She had seen that fear tonight. She had seen it in the way Dylan had fought so desperately to hold onto his version of reality, even as it crumbled around him. She had seen it in the way he had tried to reframe the moment, to make himself the victim, to turn the crowd against Keanu when it was too late. He had been afraid. Afraid of being exposed. Afraid of being seen for who he really was. Afraid of change. And now she couldn't help but wonder, would Dylan Carter ever be able to face himself? Or would he spend the rest of his life running from the truth? One last thought. Elena took a deep breath. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" "The way people try to turn everything into a fight," she said, waving a hand in the direction of the ballroom. "The way they try to put you in a corner. The way they expect you to." Keanu chuckled, cutting her off with a simple shake of his head. "Elena," he said, his voice soft but firm, "you don't have to fight just because someone else wants you to." Elena stared at him, the weight of his words hitting her in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent so long believing she had to be like Dylan Carter to survive in this industry. But maybe she was wrong. Maybe there was another way. A better way. Maybe truth didn't have to be cruel to be powerful. Maybe it just had to be honest. She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Thank you," she said. Keanu nodded. "Anytime." And with that, he walked away, disappearing into the night. Elena stood there for a long time, staring after him. And then, with a newfound sense of purpose, she flipped open her notepad and started writing. Because for the first time in her life, she knew exactly the kind of journalist she wanted to be. When the mirror breaks. The aftermath of a fall. The neon lights of Los Angeles flickered against the rain-streaked windows of the taxi as Dylan Carter sat in silence, staring at his own reflection. The mask he had worn for years, the arrogant, untouchable journalist, was cracked now, maybe even shattered. It had been 3 hours since his confrontation with Keanu Reeves at the Celeste Grand Hotel. 3 hours since he had stood in front of Hollywood's elite, desperately trying to spin the narrative in his favor. 3 hours since he had lost. Not just the argument. Not just control. But everything. His reputation. His credibility. And, worst of all, his certainty that he had been on the right side of things. The echoes of the evening still clawed at his mind, replaying over and over like a broken film reel. Keanu's words. The crowd's judgment. The realization that he wasn't feared anymore. That he wasn't even respected anymore. Because Dylan Carter had finally been seen, and what people saw wasn't pretty. The taxi came to a stop outside a dimly lit apartment complex, pulling Dylan from his thoughts. He barely noticed the driver speaking. $28.50. Dylan blinked, reaching into his pocket for his wallet, only to realize his hands were shaking. He cursed under his breath, pulling out a crumpled $50 bill and shoving it toward the driver. "Keep it." He stepped out into the cold, the city air thick with the scent of rain and regret. And then he stood there. Just stood there. Because for the first time in his life, Dylan Carter had nowhere to go. The headlines arrive. His phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He already knew what it was. He had avoided looking at social media all night, but he wasn't naive. He had spent years destroying people with headlines. Now it was his turn. With a sharp inhale, he pulled out his phone and unlocked it. The screen lit up with notifications. And there it was. His downfall, in bold, black letters. Dylan Carter's smear tactics backfire. A public humiliation unfolds. Keanu Reeves silences ruthless reporter without ever raising his voice. Hollywood turns its back on Dylan Carter. Did he finally go too far? And the worst one. Dylan Carter exposed. A career built on destroying others. Dylan's breath hitched. It wasn't just bad. It was catastrophic. Sponsors had already started pulling their contracts. The network he worked for had issued a statement, distancing itself from his actions. The wolves were circling. The same wolves he had once run with. And he knew how this worked. They weren't going to stop. Not until there was nothing left of him. His hands tightened around his phone. And then, for the first time in a very, very long time, Dylan Carter felt something he hadn't felt since he was a kid. Fear. Nowhere left to run. He stumbled up the steps to his apartment, fumbling with his keys. The doors swung open to an empty, messy living room, a stark contrast to the polished, confident image he had always projected. Stacks of papers cluttered his desk. Half-drunk bottles of whiskey sat next to unopened letters. A broken coffee mug lay forgotten in a corner. It wasn't a home. It was just a place he existed in between victories. Except now, there were no more victories. He sank onto the couch, rubbing his face. And then, almost on instinct, he grabbed the bottle of whiskey from the table, took a long, burning sip, and another, and another. But no matter how much he drank, he couldn't escape one undeniable truth. Keanu Reeves had been right. About him. About everything. And that thought hurt more than any headline ever could. The knock at the door. A sudden, sharp knock cut through the silence. Dylan frowned, setting the bottle down. No one ever came here. No one ever visited him. Another knock. A little louder this time. Dylan hesitated. Then, pushing himself up, he made his way to the door and swung it open. And froze. Because standing there, on his doorstep, was Keanu Reeves. A moment of truth. Dylan stared, completely caught off guard. What the? He stopped himself. How the hell did you find me? Keanu shrugged. It wasn't hard. Dylan gritted his teeth. What do you want? Keanu studied him for a moment. And then, in that same calm, unshakable voice, he said, I wanted to see if you were okay. Dylan laughed bitterly. Are you serious? He gestured behind him. Does this look like I'm okay? Keanu's gaze didn't waver. No, he said simply. It looks like someone who's trying to figure out what happens next. Dylan's stomach tightened, because Keanu was right. Again. And he hated it. He leaned against the doorframe, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't need your pity, Reeves. Keanu smiled slightly. It's not pity. Dylan let out a sharp breath. Then what is it? Keanu tilted his head. A second chance. Dylan stiffened. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And then, for the first time in his life, Dylan Carter had no idea what to do. The crossroads of a broken man. The man at the door. Dylan Carter had spent his life building walls. Walls made of sharp words, of manipulative tactics, of a calculated public image that made him seem untouchable. And yet, in just one night, those walls had collapsed. Now, standing at his doorstep, in the cold, dim glow of the apartment hallway, was the one man he never expected to see again. Keanu Reeves. Dylan couldn't process it. Couldn't understand why Keanu was here, after everything. After Dylan had tried to humiliate him. After he had dragged his past, his pain, his beliefs into the public eye, hoping to break him. But Keanu hadn't broken. Instead, Dylan had. And now, the man he had tried to destroy was standing here, offering him a second chance. It made no sense. And that scared Dylan more than anything else ever had. The invitation. Keanu stood there, waiting. Calm, unshaken, patient, and somehow that made Dylan angrier than anything else. You seriously came all the way here just to check on me? Dylan scoffed, crossing his arms. Do I look like someone who needs saving? Keanu didn't react. He just looked at Dylan, and in that damn quiet voice, he said, No, you look like someone who needs a drink. Mind if I come in? Dylan blinked. For a second, he almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Then he sighed, stepping aside. Fine, but don't expect some heartfelt confession, he muttered. I'm fresh out of those. Keanu smiled slightly and stepped inside. Dylan shut the door behind him, feeling like he had just let something dangerous in. But it wasn't Keanu that was dangerous. It was the truth he brought with him. 2 men, 1 room. Keanu took in the mess of the apartment, the whiskey bottles, the half-eaten takeout containers, the scattered papers and headlines. But if he was judging, he didn't show it. Instead, he walked over to the couch, sat down, and waited. Dylan poured himself another drink. "You want one?" he asked sarcastically, holding up the bottle. Keanu shook his head. "I'm good." Dylan scoffed. "Figures." He downed the drink in one go, hoping it would numb the weight in his chest. It didn't. He sat down across from Keanu, rubbing a hand over his face. "So, what, you came here to lecture me? Tell me to go on some journey of self-reflection?" Keanu shook his head. "No." Dylan frowned. "Then why?" Keanu leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything." Dylan froze. Keanu's voice wasn't full of pity. It wasn't some empty Hollywood pep talk. It was real, honest, and somehow that made it so much worse. Dylan scoffed, leaning back. "Please, you're Keanu Reeves. You've got more money, more fans, more." "I've lost people," Keanu interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. Dylan stopped cold. "I've lost friends," Keanu continued. "Family. People I loved." Dylan clenched his jaw. He didn't want to hear this. Didn't want to see Keanu as human. Because if Keanu was human, then that meant Dylan had no excuse. The mirror finally shatters. "You think I don't know what it's like to feel lost?" Keanu asked. Dylan let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, please, you don't know the first thing about being hated," Keanu cut in. "About waking up one day and realizing you don't like the person you've become." Dylan's breath caught. Keanu's eyes were steady, not accusing, not angry, just seeing him, really seeing him. And Dylan hated it, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control of the conversation. He wasn't the one exposing someone's flaws. This time, he was the one being exposed. The hardest question. Keanu exhaled, leaning back. "Dylan," he said, voice low, serious. "What happens next?" Dylan frowned. "What?" Keanu gestured to the room. "This, the headlines, the career you just lost, the people who saw who you really were tonight." Dylan clenched his fists. He knew what came next. The industry would drop him. The phone calls would stop. His name would become synonymous with failure. But he wouldn't say it out loud, because saying it meant admitting it was real. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "So, what's the plan?" Dylan let out a sharp breath. "I don't know." Keanu nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Then, after a long pause, he said something that hit Dylan harder than anything else that night. "Maybe it's time to stop being the guy people are afraid of and start being someone worth remembering." Dylan's heart skipped a beat, because for the first time, he realized. He didn't want to be Dylan Carter, the ruthless journalist, anymore. He just didn't know who else to be. The offer. Keanu stood up. Dylan frowned. "That's it? You're just gonna leave?" Keanu smiled. "That depends." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "On what?" Keanu pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and placed it on the table. Dylan hesitated before picking it up. It was an address. Nothing else. No explanation. No instructions. Dylan looked up. "What is this?" Keanu's expression was unreadable. "A place where you can start over. If you want to." Dylan's stomach tightened. He should have laughed. Should have thrown the paper back in Keanu's face. But instead, his hands shook as he held it. Because for the first time in as long as he could remember, he had a choice, and that terrified him more than anything else ever had. A road not taken, yet. Keanu turned toward the door. Before he left, he glanced back over his shoulder. "You don't have to take it," he said. "But if you do, don't waste it." And then, just like that, he was gone. Dylan sat there for a long, long time. staring at the paper, staring at his chance. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do.